Okay, so we had a very, very spirited discussion last week. And I think Michael's not here yet, but Michael was very much involved in the discussion. You too, Menashe, with regard to Shlicha Siyat Tzricha Tzar and Tzricha Tzar and the Machlokes Beisham Beisela. This is all on Mem Gimel Amid Beis at the top in the top 10 lines or so. At the end of the discussion, notwithstanding all of the back and forth, and the Gemara tells us, so the Gemara is, I don't know, maybe about 15 lines down, just inserts the words, Alahoda Amarava Shol Shlamadas, the Rabban and Gazlan Hava, Lemarava Damakebe Shamai. So that upends the entire discussion, because if you recall, we had this previously in the daf before, where the Gemara also says with regard to Rabbah, that based on the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, it would come out that Rabbah would hold like Beis Shammai. In this particular discussion, it turns out Rava and his view would hold like Beis Shammai, and as we said a number of times, that can't be. It can't be that one of the later Amoraim, because halacha goes to the latest of the Amoraim. I mean, before the Shulchan Aruch, but so the later the Amora, the greater likelihood that we paskin like him, at least in the Gemara. So since Rava was one of the later Amoraim, we would paskin like Rava, and Rava comes out and holds like Beis Shammai, and we hold like Beis Hillel. So the whole thing turns on a dime, that even though the machlokes in Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, we resolved, but we didn't resolve Rava. So as a result of the fact that Rava might hold like Beis Shammai, the Gemara again has to sort of go back to Aleph Beis, and say, okay, so the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Hillel cannot be on the question of whether or not Tzricha Chesar and Tzricha Chesar. So we have, I don't know, maybe 15 or so lines down. The Gemara starts and says, Alahacha b'shevach shel gezerah kamifigli. If everybody has it, starts in the middle of a line. Alahacha b'shevach shel gezerah kamifigli. So the Gemara now takes literally a 90-degree turn, and says as follows: till now, from the Mishnah on Daf Gimel and Aleph, till now, we've given examples of what might be the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and we speak about the value of the gezela. In other words, there was a gezela, and the question is, what is its value at the time of the gezela, or the time that he was found? Again, depending on Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The Gemara says, no, that's not the machlokes. The machlokes is not the value of the gezela. The machlokes is b'shevach shel gezela kamifligli, whether the gezela itself, the body of the gezela, the chayfetz of the gezela, increased or decreased in value. Not its outside value in the marketplace, but its inherent value of the chayfetz. What does that mean? So the Gemara says, what are we talking about? We're talking about a sheep that grew wool, or a sheep that was carrying a child, a baby. In other words, we're not worried about did it go up in value or down in value on the outside, but the actual chayfetz, the sheep, which was the item that was taken here, that was under shmira and taken, whether its value increased. So now that's a whole different approach. Well, let's take a look. We're talking about the shevach of the gezela. Let's take a look and see what Rashi says. Rashi says, "Elahacha b'shevach shel gezerah kamifligi." Says Rashi, "V'haychaser v'yasa the misnissen." The increase or decrease of price that the Mishnah talks about, lav b'yukra v'zula, not whether it went up and down in price on the marketplace. El b'mai dechosra dahana gizus, the wool b'maisha hutira kagon imnis abra etzlo, or what are the increase in value because it became carrying a child. The Beis Shammai savar hakol yishalem k'Rab Meir. The brisa. We're going to learn this brisa, but machlokes between Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda as to what you do, and Beis Shammai will hold like Rav Meir, as we'll see. Beis Hillel to Rabbi Yehuda. And Beis Hillel will hold Rabbi Yehuda that it is when it leaves the house of the Balim, and in that particular case, it had not yet become, had not yet grown wool, or had not yet had carrying this baby sheep. So now let's take a look at the Gemara. So in other words, that's the machlekes. Beis Shammai savei shevach gezela the nigzel haba. Beis Shammai holds that the shevach, the improvement of the gezela, belongs to the owner of the nigzel. Beis Hillel savrei, and Beis Hillel says shevach gezela the gazlan haba, that the shevach of the gezela belongs to the gazlan, like we'll see in a minute in the machlekes in the brisa. Why? Because he has to return what he stole, not what the animal increased later by having a child or by having more wool. That's not part of the equation according to Beis Hillel. He returns what he stole, and what he stole was just the sheep, nothing more. Okay, ubeplukted the hana tanoi, and this machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is dependent on a machlekes tanoi. What's the machlekes? The Tanya, because we learned hagozel is a rechel. If someone stole the sheep, rechel is a sheep. Gozaza, and he shored the sheep or whatever. He clipped off the wool, the yolda, and or gave birth. Mishalem osa veskizaseh vesledoseh. He has to return osa, meaning the sheep and the wool and the child. Divrei Rav Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and in that brisa, Rabbi Yehuda says gezela chazeres be'eineho, that you return the gezela be'eineho. In other words, what you stole. What you stole was not an animal that had given birth or an animal that had wool. So therefore, he's saying that it's the gazlan who makes up the difference. In other words, kind of a windfall. But according to Beis Shammai, according to Beis Hillel, he's true to his thinking that you fine him from the time he stole it, and from the time he sold it, all he stole was a sheep. He gives back a sheep. Remember what we said: the Heshav is exela, not where the sheep was no longer here, where you have to do valuation. But if you have the sheep, you return the sheep, right? Because the actual chayfetz is what you return. So by returning the sheep, he's made the owner whole. The owner doesn't know from wool or from a new sheep that was born. That happened after, according to Beis Hillel. When the Beis Shammai, no, the gazlan can't benefit from the gezela, even though it didn't happen, so to speak, in the actual theft, but he can't benefit from the gezela, so he has to return the whole thing. So that's the focus now.
Rabbi, does kefil or daled v'hei ever enter into this?
No, because kefil and daled v'hei is only when there is a when it goes to Bezdin and there is a knas and Bezdin. If this matter went to Bezdin, you're right, it would be daled v'hei and kefil. But since we're talking about where the whole thing was sort of nipped in the bud or happened before a din Torah before it went to Bezdin, in which case kefil doesn't apply because it didn't have the din yet, and kefil is only through Bezdin. So,
all right, but I have a problem here.
Yeah,
my understanding, not being a shepherd, is that it takes months for the sheep to grow the wool.
right.
I mean, just like our own hair, it doesn't grow in a day.
Right.
So he on May 1st steals
When
the
he
sheep.
stole it was a bare sheep.
It was a bare sheep. It had just been shorn a month before, whatever.
Right.
He steals it on May 1st. Oh, you're saying that it's bare. So when he returns it on, let's say, September 1st,
August 1st,
and he'd gone ahead, whatever, and he's gone ahead and sheared it again. So I see. So it's the same amount.
It's
But
the
if
same amount.
But if May, let's say it hadn't been shorn since February, and it's already halfway there, and now he returns it after it's been freshly shorn, really, he's in a sense, did all the wool that the gazlan took exist at the time they stole it? No, but maybe half of it did.
Right. So you're hitting on what is really a machlekes of the Rishonim and others as to whether or not Rabbi Yehuda really takes his position in your case. In the case where when you shave your beard and then 10 days later you already have a growth, it's not full, it's not there, but there's already a growth. So the sheep already had growth, but it didn't have complete growth. So there's a machlokes whether in that case Rabbi Yehuda would admit to Reb Meir that that's really having stolen the wool as well. I grant you, but the actual machlokes is when it was completely bare, or there was no sign of any pregnancy, so to speak, and it all happened later. There, clearly, that's the machlokes tanoim, and that's what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing about. On the question of whether or not it was partially with wool, or it was already looking like it was pregnant with a baby or something, there's a machlokes whether or not Rabbi Yehuda would admit. Not everybody says it, but some of them say, yes, in that case, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that what he stole was really an animal with wool. So he has to return, according to Beis Hillel, an animal with wool, right? In other words, Rabbi Yehuda's not arguing that you don't return what you stole. If you stole it with wool, you return it with wool. But clearly, if you stole it without wool, you return it without wool. And Reb Meir says, no, you return it with everything that happened in the interim. And that's now the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Not what the value is out in the marketplace, but what happened with the chayfetz itself. In this case, this is the example. So now we're going to see how that changes the machlokes. But you're right. So it's not all or nothing. Now,
Excuse me,
what's
Rabbi.
interesting is that what is this machlokes based on? I mean, what do you think the machlokes is between Meir and Yehuda? They just grabbed out of thin air that you return it with the wool, without the wool. So there is a concept here, as in this machlokes. It's not just happenstance. What's the concept? The concept is the concept of shinui. We know b'derech klal and shas that shinui, a changing the physical attributes, or a changes the status of an item. That's b'chlal in shas. So in our case, this is the question, and the machlokes between the Tanoim, Reb Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. The focal point is whether it was Meshaneh, is this a new chayfetz or is it an old chayfetz? If you hold Shinui is a new chayfetz, then this is not the chayfetz he stole. So in other words, now let's put our thinking caps on. You stole an item, that item doesn't exist anymore. Why? Because it's Meshaneh. It has changed its composition. So now you go back and say, okay, so what do I do? I don't have that item anymore. So David, to your question, when does in other words, what are we thinking about here in terms of a new chayfetz or not? So we say this is a new chayfetz. It's new. It's Meshaneh. It no longer has the properties of the old chayfetz. According to Meir, there's no shinui, right? Because it's the same animal. Oh yes, it has some growth. It has whatever. But according to Yehuda, it's really Meshaneh. So that's the substance of the machlokes is in shinui. Yeah, Jay.
I'm a little bit confused. When it comes to a sheep, certain things are normal. They will continue to happen. Growing wool will continue to happen with the sheep. So you have to assume that what he stole, that whatever the status was in the growing cycle, it's going to be generating wool. Whether a sheep is pregnant or not, that's not guaranteed. So why don't they separate out those two cases in terms of it's guaranteed to create wool, so that's part of the animal, no matter what state it is, and you really have to replace the animal with at least the amount of wool that it's grown already since the last time it was cut. Pregnancies may have a much lower probability of happening at any one given time. So to me, those cases are different.
I understand your point. I think from the Gemara's standpoint, the Gemara is telling us that when we took since now we're talking about increases and decreases in the body of the animal. Remember, we left the whole concept of appreciation out. So there's no longer the discussion is not about yes or v'chaser, whether it's worth more or worth less. It's about whether the animal is the same or not the same. Has it again? So the reason why they lump those two together, because those two are part of the animal. I understand they're different, but they're part and parcel of the animal. The animal gives off wool, and the animal has baby sheep. So the Gemara puts them together because it doesn't look at it from the standpoint that, yeah, wool is an automatic cycle, and maybe sheep having a sheep is not an automatic cycle having a baby. That aside, the Gemara puts them together because they are both shevach within the animal. I think that's the point here, is that the animal itself gives off something, right? Either a baby or sheep or wool. And the question is, how do we treat that something? So the Gemara isn't going to parse words and say, yeah, wool is kind of a little bit different, and having a baby sheep is kind of a little bit different. They put it together because the point of our Gemara is that the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is about something that inherently happens to the animal. So they look at what can happen to the animal. It can have wool, it can have a child. I mean, those are the two different things that can be mishana, that can change within the animal. I think that's probably the approach here. So we're not going to sort of split hairs, so to speak, and say wool is one thing and baby sheep are another. But the point is, what's the point? The point is that the real machlokes between Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is whether this is the same animal. Did a shinui occur? And shinui, generally in Shas, there is that machlokes. When something is mishane, when something changes, it's no longer the original item. If it's no longer the original item, then according to Rabbi Yehuda, wait a minute, wool, that's not part of this equation. The animal is what was stolen. The animal has to be returned. So says Rabbi Yehuda, so says Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says no. Beis Shammai says that he doesn't hold that Shinui changed it. Yeah, Shinui is a Shinui, but here it's part and parcel of the animal. So the concept of Shinui, he's saying, can't apply here because, like you say, Jay, it will naturally give off wool. So you can't really argue. Oh, it was Mishane. Yeah, it was Mishane because it grew a beard. It grew wool, but it's still the same animal. So for Beis Shammai, it's the same animal. It's not Mishane. Yeah.
When somebody steals a car, and you have to give back the whole car,
Let's say he paints the car, he paints it a different color. Right.
Whatever. No, you have to give back the car with 4 wheels.
Right.
You can't give it back with 3 wheels.
Right.
So you have to give back the complete. In a sheep that has partially grown wool, you should have to give back the equivalent of the partially grown wool. I mean, they seem to be talking about the core of the animal without the wool and without another baby. But that's kind of normal.
But you see, you're not entirely wrong, because there are those Manda Amrim who say in Rabbi Yehuda that Rabbi Yehuda would agree with Reb Meir where the animal was stolen with wool. It hadn't been shorn yet, but it's stolen with wool, or it was pregnant and hadn't given birth yet. So the completion of the sort of shinoi didn't happen. So some argue that Rabbi Yehuda would agree with Reb Meir, and others say no, that extra growth or the child is not part of what he stole. The fact that it had a child and was carrying a child, but there was no child. There was no real child there, right, so to speak. And we're not going to argue whether or not the child in its gestation is considered the child or not. We're not going there. We're just saying that there wasn't a child, or that there wasn't shorn wool. So that's the machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda. But at least Rabbi Yehuda takes the position that if you stole just a bare sheep, that's all you have to return, and that's Beis Hillel's position. So now we have a different approach to the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and let's see what the Gemara tells us. So the Gemara tells us, Rabbi Yehuda Gezela Chazeres Bein, and Gemara says Dekenami, a proof that this is the machlokes. In other words, another proof. Diktani Beis Shammai Amim Yelaka B'Choser V'Yeser, Beis Hillel Amim Kishas Tzah Shemamina. In other words, the Gemara wants to say this is the real machlokes and prove it from the words of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, because Beis Shammai says Yiloke becheser beyeser. He uses terminology which is appropriate for the marketplace. Cheser meaning less, yeser meaning more, right? And Beshul says b'shas heitzah. So they're using the terminology that applies to this particular machlokes. Let's take a look at how Rashi explains it. The words choser and yeser lav biyukra v'zula, not in whether the price went down or the price went up for the animal. El v'may de chosra, the hanagizus, v'may shehusra, and what, in other words, what it lost, meaning the wool was shorn, v'may shehusra, and what it went up, kagon im nisabra, right? So that's the machlokes. Now, and look at we said that Rashi. Now look at the next Rashi, Dekanami, a proof, the begizus for Yoledas pligi, that the machlokes is about sharing wool or giving birth. How do we know? Diktani loshen chosav v'yoser. It uses the loshen chosav v'yoser, v'lo katani loshen zul v'yoker. So this is the key. The key is that if it was talking about price in the marketplace, it wouldn't say chosav v'yoser. It would say zul v'yoker. Zul meaning it became cheaper, or yoker became more expensive. So Rashi is giving us a clearer picture of what the appropriate verbiage is. If you're talking about value in the market, you use the word zul v'yoker. If you're talking about the appreciation of the chayfetz, the animal itself, then we use choser v'yoser. So again, in other words, so Rashi is explaining clearly what the Gemara is telling us b'dekinami. But anyway, so this is now the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, comparable to the machlokes of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in the Brisa, that we're talking about whether the animal itself was increased or decreased, and therefore Rabbi Meir, Beis Shammai, who is more machmir, always, as we say, like Rabbi Meir, he says that you have to return everything to the nigzal. And the Beis Hillel holds like a Yehuda that you don't. But again, keep in mind that this machlokes of shinui, there are those who explain Rabbi Yehuda that Rabbi Yehuda can only say what he says if there was nothing on the sheep when it was stolen, because you're returning it as it is, and as it is a bare sheep. If it had wool on it, this is the machlokes. It had wool on it, but not sufficient to shear it yet. So what do we do? That's the dilemma. So those Manda Omrim would say the fact that it had wool, you got to return it with wool. You can't return it with only some wool, because by now the wool has fully grown and you shore it. You got to give them back the wool. You can't return an animal with half of a baby. You got to return the whole baby. So again, the precision of this machlokes will depend on your interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda. But just understand that the whole machlokes is of Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yehuda is based on this concept of shinui. Okay, so now we have kind of taken care of Beis Shammai, right? Because Beis Shammai in the Mishnah, we went to understand what was the machlokes. Now the Gemara says that this is the machlokes in terms of the chayfetz itself, not in terms of its outside value. Now, now we understand that. Now, so we've gone over the Shammai and Beis Hillel. Now, who is the third man of the Mishnah? The third man was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva b'shas haTuvia means at the time of the claim, and the Tuvia. When is the claim? The claim is when you before the Bezdin. So the simple explanation was that what's the value at the time of Bezdin? Okay, so that's a whole different view than Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. So let's take a look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva b'shas haTuvia, Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, halacha k'Rabbi Akiva, that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, not like Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, but like Rabbi Akiva, that we look at the time of the claim. Umode Rabbi Akiva. Now here, this is interesting. Rabbi Akiva himself will admit, "B'makom sheyesh edim," where there are edim who saw the geneva, the gazela, that you don't wait until you come to court, which could be a month or weeks later, but B'shas HaTaviyah is the time of when the Adim saw it. So now we have a different view that with the Adim, you look at the value at the time of the theft, because the theft was seen by Adim. So that according to Rabbi Akiva, it's not later on when it's before Bezdin, but it's at the time of theft because there were Adim. Why Tama? My Tama. Why would Rabbi Akiva agree to this? Because it says in the pasuk in Shmos, Tamakol Ashehu Lo Yitnenu B'Yom Ashmoso. So now we have an interesting interpretation, because it says at the time when it was his, meaning at the time that the activity occurred. It then says the Yitnenu B'Yom Ashmoso, that he has to give him at the time of his guilt. When was he guilty? If there are Adim, he was already guilty at the time of the theft, because the Adim will say you stole. That's the greatest form of proof. You don't need anything better than Adim, right? So the Adim said he stole it. That's the day of Ashmaso. That's the day of his guilt. So then, according to this, Rabbi Akiva would say no, that it's not before Bezdin. It is right away at the time of the actual Gezela, because and that's okay. So far that's the way we understand the Gemara. So Shmuel says the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, but Rabbi Akiva himself says, even though I normally say it's the time of Bezdin, but I will agree that when there are Adim, it's the time of Adim, because the whole pasuk that you learn it from is the La'asher Hu Shmaso, is the La'asher Hu Lo Yitnenu B'Yom Hashmaso. So how do you interpret B'Yom Hashmaso? You can only interpret it as the day of his guilt, and guilt goes when you already have witnesses. Okay, fine. I understand. Yeah, go ahead.
Doesn't everything go according to when it happened and you had Adim? Why would you have a case that it's when it goes to Bezdin? When somebody sees an action that's not correct, you postmark it, that's the time, because there were Adim. There shouldn't be any other options when in that kind of a scenario.
Okay, what happens if there are no Adim,
Right,
and we come to Bezdin, and Bezdin is able to give a psak because, let's say, Simonim. Let's say it's not Adim, but it was because of Simonim.
All I'm saying is that when there are Adim, shouldn't it always be the case that the timing and the discussion is based on the time that it happened, because there are two Adim?
That's what we're saying. The Gemara is saying that even though Rabbi Akiva says B'shas Tvia, which is one before Bezdin, well, Rabbi Akiva will admit that when there are Adim, you don't value it later on at the time you're standing in front of court, which could change the value of the item. You do it instantly at the time of the Gezela. You say whatever it was worth. That's what you do because you have Adim. You're 100% correct.
Everybody agrees to that. Is that universal? At the time when, if Adim sees something, that's the time that gets accepted no matter what?
That's the way we're interpreting the pasuk in the Torah. Yes, we're not. We're going to have a further discussion, so hold off. But you're right. At this point in time, we're interpreting the pasuk B'Yom Hashmoso, the day of his guilt. Is when was he guilty? He was guilty when the Adim saw it. Not. You don't have to wait to they're saying right now. Hold on. This is an interim discussion that you don't have to wait till Bezdin, because guilt already occurred, even though you're still going to go to Bezdin, but you're going to go to Bezdin a month later, 2 months later, and the Adim already pronounced guilt, b'shas hagzela, right?
Yeah.
That's our interpretation right now, that it's b'shas hagzela, because, and Rabbi Akiva would admit to it. Not the final word, but that's the discussion, right? Okay, weiter. So now.
Sorry for
No. Okay, so that's all Rabbi Yehuda Meshmuel. Now let's go a little step further. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Oshia said to Rabbi Yehuda, also to a Moroim, Rabbi, Ata Omer came. This is what you say, right? Because it says Rabbi Yehuda Meshmuel. So Rabbi Oshia said to his Rabbi Yehuda, this is what you're saying in the name of Shmuel, right? Hochi Omer Rav Asi and Rabbi Yochanan. Now we're gonna cite Rav Asi and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was the Gadol. Rabbi Yochanan was the Gadol Adar. Okay, I mean these were all big Gedolim, but Rabbi Yochanan was everybody's Rebbe. He was the main Rebbe. So you're saying, Rabbi Yehuda, that's the pshat. Let me quote to you Rav Asi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. What is he saying? Cholakaya Rabbi Akiva, afilu b'makom sheyesh edim. In the name of Rabbi Yochanan, it says that Rabbi Akiva argued, and that he disagreed, that even when there are witnesses, you still have to wait until Psak Bezdin. That's why I said, Jay, not so fast. Rabbi Yehuda Mishmul says, wait a minute, Edim is Edim. Edim is definitive. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you have Edim, but you still have to wait till the Psak of Bezdin, because you have to wait for the official imprimatur. The official imprimatur of Bezdin happened a time later. So you see that it's not universal that everybody says that Rabbi Akiva says that it's okay with Edim. No, Rabbi Yochanan says that afilu sheyesh Edim, you still go by the Bezdin. My Tama, what's the reason? And he cites the same pasuk, the Omakro Lashehulo Yitnenu B'Yoim Ashmoso, that it's the day of his guilt. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, guilt is not definitive until Bezdin says so. So now we have a discussion in the Gemara of whether or not, even though the Edom saw what they saw, and they can say with certainty that that's what they saw, but wait a minute. Okay, maybe another set of Edom will come and say you're wrong, right? I mean, until it's final, it's not final, because someone may come and say these Edom are not the Edom Zomimim. These Edom were with us at the time, right? The famous, Edom Zomimim. They're going to complain that the Edom are not accurate because they were 100 miles away when the accident happened, or they didn't see it clearly, or whatever the reason. So Edom, as strong as Edom are, by the way, it's very interesting because Lamaisa, under common law, you have witnesses, right? Witnesses saw something. There is a statistic which is kind of really almost mind-boggling, and I don't remember the percentage. But they say that there's a certain substantial percentage of eyewitnesses who, even though they said they saw it, didn't see the right thing. And there's a study done that witnesses, you think, oh, witnesses open and shut. It's not so. Witnesses, they interpret what they saw. Yes, they saw it, but all of a sudden, what they saw, seeing is believing, or believing is seeing, depending how you look at it. But in other words, eyewitness is not necessarily always 100% accurate. So we're not going to impugn the witnesses. They saw what they saw. But according to this Shita, according to Rabbi Yochanan, no, let this play out to its logical conclusion. Meaning, the witnesses come in, they testify. No one says the witnesses were wrong. And we rely on Pnishnayim Eidim. But you have to let the process play out. If the process plays out and the witnesses turn out to be right, and they're right. But if the process turns out that the witnesses are wrong, then it's Bezdin who will have the final say. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Akiva does not admit that in the case of Edim, you go by the day of the Gezela, because it's not yet final. Yom HaTviyah, according to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, Yom HaTviyah is literally the day the Bezdin says guilty. So, in other words, eyewitness is not a definitive proof, according to who? Rabbi Yochanan. So now let's go weiter. So now we have a machlokes. And Bezdin is the one who gives him the imprimatur of guilt. Okay, so now we have a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel and Rav Ashi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan was the gadol, as to what the correct interpretation is. So now Gemara goes weiter, and by the way, this is not unusual, because you would say, wait a minute, it's over. Rabbi Yochanan said, Amalei Rav Zera Rav Abba Bar Papa, where we know Abba Bar Papa, because he was one of the 10 sons of Rav Papa, who we recite in a seal, right? Nachman Bar Papa, Abba Bar Papa. So in this way, Rav Zera said to Abba Bar Papa, he said to him, okay, I hear out in the street that there's a machlokes here. Rabbi Yehuda Bishmul says one thing, and Rav Ashi and Rabbi Yochanan says something else. Let's go. So let's find a shlishi. Let's find a third Manda Amar. When you go over there, meaning when you travel to Eretz Yisrael, Akif Asulmud Tzur. And Rashi will explain that, and take a circuitous route and go there to the village that's in the mountains of Tzur, Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi, and go to Rav Yaakov Ba'idi, also a tremendous gadol, Uboy Minei, and ask Rav Yaakov Ba'idi, Ishmiel Rabbi Yochanan, Halacha Rabbi Akiva, or in Halacha Rabbi Akiva. Did he hear from Rabbi Yochanan? Because it still goes back to Rabbi Yochanan, who was the gadol Adar. He says, what did he hear from Rabbi Yochanan? Because he was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan. Halacha Rabbi Akiva, which means in all cases, or ein Halacha Rabbi Akiva, that Eidim do have a finality to it as well. In other words, let's get a definitive answer on this question about Eidim. Amalei, he said to him, Hacham Rabbi Yochanan. So he went to Rav Yaakov Ba'idi, and Rav Yaakov Ba'idi said the following: Halacha Rabbi Akiva la'olam. The halacha is like Rabbi Akiva la'olam, forever. Now, so again, what does that mean? My la'olam. Okay, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva la'olam. What does la'olam mean? Rav Ashi Shelo Tomar. That when it says that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, it says Shelo Tomar Hanim Eliyahu Edim. That you should not say, when are the words of Rabbi Akiva valid? Lo. So in other words, he's saying that that the halacha is that Rabbi Akiva's psak is a psak even when there are edim. Now, edim should not be the reason why you would change your mind. So the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, that even when there are edim, you still have to wait until the psak of Bezdin, because of the words of the Torah. And the Torah says about Hashama, about being guilty, guilt is only pronounced by Bezdin. Okay, so that's one interpretation, and he says that's the reason. That's the reason why the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. But okay, that's one answer. The inami, and there's another explanation of these words of Rabbi Akiva. The hadladuchta, the ispera. What does that mean? So we had a machlokes several blot previous. There was a machlokes with the Rava and Rabbi Shmuel, and I think with Rabbi Yehuda, maybe Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yehuda, as to whether or not. Remember, if you took something and the owner was far away, let's say the owner was in Eretz Yisrael, you're in Bavel, you took something away, and then you put it back in its place. You remember we had a machlokes, is putting it back in its place as if it didn't happen, because the owner is no wiser, because the owner is way out there? Or do we say if he took it, even though the owner doesn't know, the only way he can give it back is if he tells the owner, I took it and I'm giving it back? Remember that. That was a machlokes that we had in a previous Gemara. And so Rabbi Shmuel says in that Gemara that that you have to, Rabbi Shmuel said in that Gemara, lo be'inin das balim. That, as Rashi pointed out, that you don't need das balim, you can take it and give it back without telling the owner, okay? But the other mandama, I think it was Rabbi Yehuda, says, no, you need das balim. So the Gemara is explaining the inami, the hadbel, the dufta, the yaspa, la afuke mid Rabbi Shmuel, that when we say the halacha is Rabbi Akiva la'olam, what we're saying is we're excluding Rabbi Shmuel, the Omer lo bin das balim. Kamash malon to be in das balim. In other words, the machlokes here is on another plane. That when we say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva la'olam, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, who says, like that Manda Omar, that you need das balim. So he's excluding. So it was Rabbi Akiva, not Rabbi Yehuda. Sorry, it was Rabbi Akiva who disputed Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says you don't need das balim. Rabbi Akiva said you need das balim. So when it says like paskin like Rabbi Akiva la'olam in this Gemara, it means to exclude Rabbi Yishmael in the other machlokes that we had between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva as to whether or not you need das balam. So when we say that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva la'olam, it means that you need das balam. You have to alert the owner that you took it in order to properly say, I'm giving it back. You can't just surreptitiously take it and put it back as if nothing happened. You have to let the owner know. So that's pshat in Rabbi Akiva. So what do we take from here? So the halacha now is that, unlike what we said earlier, Jay, that it's great. Adam saw it, and therefore the din is it goes by Adam. No, Rabbi Akiva says it can only be when it's by Bezdin, because there are all kinds of possibilities until you get to Bezdin. I mentioned one. I said you can have 80 zomamin. Someone can come and say these Adam are not kosher Adam. They weren't there. They whatever. You can impugn the Adam. If you impugn the Adam, then you no longer have a guilt verdict, because the Adam is all you have. So you have to wait until the Adam are accepted by Bezdin. They're proven to be righteous. They're proven to be correct. And it's Bezdin who puts its final stamp on it. And that's Pshat Rabbi Akiva. So now we see that Rabbi Akiva's interpretation of Kishas Tvia at the time when the claim is adjudicated means at the time of Bezdin and not before, for the reason we just said, because you can't, even though eyewitnesses are eyewitnesses, but you can't rely on them 100% because of the possibility that those Adam will be impugned. Therefore, the only thing you can do is wait to Bezdin. So let's look at Rashi. Rashi will help us understand this. So, in other words, even though Rabbi Yochanan, in other words, at that point in time, it's like today, let's say Rabbi Moshe Zecher Tzadik L'Bracha gave a psak, okay, and now you have all these lamdanim. Everybody is a big gadol, and they say, "Oh, Rabbi Moshe said this." Wait a minute, no, Rabbi Moshe said, but what did he really say? You have to understand what Rabbi Moshe said. So so who are you going to go to? So you're going to go to Moshe Tendler, let's say. You're going to go to his son-in-law who was sitting with Rabbi Moshe, and you say, Moshe Tendler, what did Rabbi Moshe mean? Because what he says in Psak isn't clear. So Moshe Tendler is going to give you a hasbara. He's going to explain to you exactly what Moshe Feinstein said when he said thus and such, so that his words can become clear. So this is what happened there. Even though Rabbi Yochanan said what he did, but there were those who said, wait a minute, no, I was there, and that's not what Rabbi Yochanan meant. So they went to Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi, who was the Talmud Muvik, let's say, of Rabbi Yochanan, and they asked him, what did Rabbi Yochanan mean? So Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi gave them an explanation. He said, Rabbi Yaakov, what he meant was, Bezdin means Bezdin. Bezdin means that you can't rely on Adam, you have to go to Bezdin. So that's how Torah was learned. It was learned because you went to the Gadol, and then you went, it was a machlokes, what the Gadol said, then you went to the person who you believed had the most definitive understanding, which is why, again, okay, so that's Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi, but the notion that when you have different Amayroim who are interpreting a Tana, we normally say that we go to the latest of the Amayroim who have the clear insight of everybody before him and came out with a different psak. So even though there was earlier Amoraim and later Amoraim, the early Amoraim were Mekubal at the time that they said it. But when a later Amora came and said, you know what, I now understand what the Tana said, I now understand what the early Amoraim said, and now I'm going to give you a pshat, which is either quite the same or a little bit different. So we go Achron Chaviv. We say the latest is the definitive. Now, what do? We later had, the Ramah and the Bach and all the others who came later, and they gave us psak halacha. So why should we take their psak more than we take Rava's or psak because he was an Amora? Because they had the clarity of the Amoraim and the later discussion and could glean from that what it meant. Now, lest you say that if today we have Gedolim who say differently, let's say, than what the Ramah would have said or the Shulchan Aruch, why don't we go to the current version of a halacha as an example? And I think the answer to that is that at the time of the Bach and the Ramah, I think Chazal came together and said, rather than, since we're now doing what we believe is a definitive understanding of the law, we're going to establish it without making changes later. Because l'chayra, and again, I don't want to get into this controversy, but just to say that there are people today who say, why can't we mechadish Hallel for a new Yom Tov? I mean, look, no less of a miracle was what we just, Yom Yerushalayim was just a few days ago, and it was the greatest miracle we can all say that we saw. We saw a miracle. We saw a ness. How is it that we can't say Hallel when we saw a ness? That's what Hallel is. It's glorifying Hashem for the Nisim. And there are those who take it very seriously and say, no, we have to say Hallel because it is such a great ness. Again, without getting into the controversy of who's right and wrong, all I want to say is, so those who don't say Hallel are no less patriotic to Eretz Yisrael and no less see miraculous events from the Yad HaRabbeinu, no less, of course, no less. But the question is, at the time that the Shulchan Aruch was established, the Chazal with their godless and we say Ruach HaKodesh or their godless said we're going to define now for once and for all for B'dairis Abiyas Hagoyel. We're going to define the halacha so we shouldn't have a back and forth, and they defined it. Again, some people will say yes, but you have to make exceptions. You have to say, you have to not say. That's a discussion for another time in another place. But I just want to explain in the lineage of halacha, when we go from Tanoim to Amoraim to Rishonim to Achronim until we finally have a Shulchan Aruch. Again, we have to go with Das Sekanim. We have to go with the Das of the Gedolim of the time that we live in, and at the time of the Shulchan Aruch, they made that establishment for better or for worse. We are now the fruits of that labor, and we accept it. Again, those who say, but you have to make an exception because of such a godless, I'm not saying they're wrong. I can't say they're right and wrong because there's nothing wrong with saying even Hallel with, some say with a bracha, without a bracha. Again, those are discussions that are really quite different, but because we can't really definitively say. But again, our Masorah is that the halacha, either depending on whether you're Ashkenaz or Sfard, really has a difference, is the Bach, the Ramah, and then the explanation of the Taz and all the others on the Shulchan Aruch. So basically, that's the codified law that we accept, and the reason for it is, as I explained, is because basically Achron Chaviv until we come to a point where there's no longer an Achron. In other words, after the Shulchan Aruch, there's no longer an Achron. There's no longer a later substitute for the Shulchan Aruch. So Rashi says, let's look at Rashi here. So Rashi says, okay, Umodi Rabbi Akiva b'makom sheyesh edim. In the earlier version of the Gemara, we had that Rabbi Akiva admitted, according to Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, that when there was edim, kama hoyse shava b'yom shegozla, the day that it was stolen, because that's when the witnesses testified, v'roy shegozla haimenu, and the witnesses saw that it was stolen. The mishalim kishas exela. It made sense to say what? That you pay for the value at the time of the Gezela because the witnesses are definitive. So, the Gemara, my Talmud Rabbi Akiva, the Amar Kishas HaTviyah. What's the reason behind Rabbi Akiva that he says at the time of the Tviyah of the claim adjudication? And he says, okay, the Amar Kro b'yom hashmosa. Now we had a machlokes what that pasuk meant, but at the time we said b'yom hashmosa, the domim shall osa yom, the value, the money that it was worth that day, shehu mischayev lo, the day of his guilt. The hechad the tava v'hoda the alpivhu mischayev, and where the Tviyah came and he admitted the alpivhu mischayev, and this is why we don't say kefil David because there was no kanat, because he himself admitted that he did it. When you admit, you don't pay kefil. Who mischayev hamarasa bedin v'hodasa v'hodaaso hu yom hashmoso. And his admission is the day of his guilt, right? And that would be at the time before Bezdin. But our thinking is if the witnesses saw it, then that's the guilt. The guilt is that the witnesses saw it and they testified. So that was the earlier thinking. That was the version we quoted. Then the Gemara came back and said, no, wait, that's not what we mean. So they said, Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi lahosam in other words, Rav Ashi said to Abba Bar Papa, "You're going Hossam." What is Hossam? Rashi says Eretz Yisrael, and on your way to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel, Akif. So what does Akif mean? Says Rashi, Herbe esaderech, you will increase your way. In other words, you'll go out of your way. Besaviv, you go around derech harucha, a longer way. You're not going to go the shortcut to Eretz Yisrael. You're going to take a derech harucha. Because of this question, it's so important that that you have to take a circuitous route. Lelechas derech mala shel hatzur. You've got to go and traverse the terrain that is up in the mountains by Har Tzur, Makam Shir Rabbi Yaakov Sham, where Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi lives, and he was the Talmud Muvik of Rabbi Yochanan, Uboy Minei, Ma Shama Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbo, Al-Kach. What did he hear when he was sitting at the feet of Rabbi Yochanan? What did Rabbi Yochanan mean? Right? What did Rabbi Moshe mean? What did any gadol mean? You go to the Talmud Muvik. Kol Mahalach Derech Harucha. So Rashi is explaining, anytime you take a longer route, when there is a shorter route, makif hu, you use the word makif. Makif means circuitous. In other words, I can go directly to Eretz Yisrael. I go out of my way to stop off at the home of Yaakov Ba'idi and ask a shaila. And by the way, that is the, it's very interesting. The Gemara says this because the Masorah throughout the generations was that when people traveled, and they traveled near where an Adam Gadol lived, they went out of their way to visit the Adam Gadol. So now it makes sense. Why did they go out of their way? They could have gone straight to where they were going, because there's a certain chashivas in stopping by where an Adam Gadol is, and either just seeing the Adam Gadol, or talking to him and learning, or asking him questions, all of these things. And that's where it comes from. It comes from the fact that you should not sort of bypass. If you can, under the circumstance, you shouldn't bypass an Adam Gadol. You should really try to, if it's obviously if it's within reason, to see the Hadras Panim of Adam Gadol and to be able to learn from him. So here he was saying, okay, you're going to go to Eretz Yisrael anyway, and since we have this burning question, what does Rabbi Yochanan mean? Go and stop off even if it's out of the way. Go to Rabbi Yaakov Ba'idi and see what Rabbi Yochanan said. So what did he say? He said that we hold like Rabbi Kiva la'olam, no dispute. Rabbi Kiva is la'olam, and therefore we gave the two explanations in the Gemara. What does it mean la'olam? So the first explanation was what we said here, that to exclude the witnesses. The second, inami dahadla l'duchta, says Rashi lahocha ashmina la'olam. What does la'olam mean? Lomer she'im hechzira l'makoma la'achash shalach bayad. This is what we said. If he returns the gezela to its place after he did shlichas yad. Now, here's the important thing, because the Gemara there says v'nishbra b'aynes. Remember, he took this item and then he had charata. He returned it. Perfectly fine. Never happened. Now, after he returned it, for whatever reason, the item broke. Had nothing to do with him. The item broke. Af b'zu halacha k'Rabbi Akiva. Even in this circumstance, the halacha is k'Rabbi Akiva d'amala el yabiganit. Tola min ha'eder, tzorech das balim. You need das balim, which means that if you stole it and then you have karata, I put it back, and then later on, having nothing to do with you, the item breaks, you're mechoyev because you didn't return it. According to Rabbi Akiva, you only return it when you tell the owner, salachti, I took it and I returned it. But yet, if you returned it without the owner knowing, and then something happened to it later for which you had no direct connection, you're still chayiv, because we hold that tzorech das balim. That's what he means, Rabbi Akiva la'olam, that you need das balim. Okay? Now, so that's the end of the discussion. So now we have a clear picture of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and Rabbi Akiva. And just to make matters a little cloudy, so the Gemara right here, the last words before the next Mishnah says the following. Rava Omar, halacha kebeis Hillel. Rava disputes the conventional wisdom that the halacha is like who? Like Rabbi Akiva. We just got through saying that the great Rabbi Yochanan says, what? The halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, la'olam, forever. Comes Rava, and he says, halacha kebeis Hillel. Now, mind you, but Rava says Rashi, kebeis Hillel, kishas gezela, that it's b'shas gezela. Now look at these words of Rashi. Ba'anon kerova of dinan dahavale basra'ah. We paskin like Rava because he was the later of the Amoraim. So all that I've been saying this morning is borne out here in Rashi, that even though Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, we say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva la'olam, says Rabbi Yochanan. Nevertheless, Rava, who was later on, says no, I don't hold like that. I hold the halacha is like Beis Hillel, not like Rabbi Akiva, and that's the definitive halacha. So you see how it comes full circle that the Torah, we have this wonderful machlokes in the Mishnah between three tremendous Tanoim, right? You have Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara, this whole daf gave us a back and forth in Beis Shammai, in Beis Hillel, in Rabbi Akiva, and we saw the nuances of all of the different psak. And at the end, even though Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, Rava, who was later, says the halacha is like Beis Hillel, and that's the way we paskin. So that in the halacha that we've codified, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, that it's b'shas gezela, not b'shas taviyah. Okay.
Rabbi, just to complicate your modern reference, a few years ago, you probably remember this too, that Rabbi Tendler and one of Reb Moshe's sons differed on how Reb Moshe really understood a pronouncement he had made on brain death.
On brain death, yeah.
Rabbi Tendler and Reb Moshe's son,
right,
on what Reb Moshe really meant when he said that.
Right.
Which is very analogous to what you just.
No, absolutely. So again, when the halacha, when the Baal halacha Reb Moshe gave a psak, and you can start clearing what did he mean in it. So now again, so this is a modern day example of what this whole discussion is about. So you have Reb Moshe's son, who was a gadol. I'm not sure which one it was, Reb Reuven, maybe, I don't know which one. And you have Reb Moshe Tendler, and then you have the question of who had the sort of the inside, the last word with Reb Moshe. Do you know how it was definitively answered? I don't remember, but that's a perfect example of what you have here. And I don't know if did it end? How did it end? I don't know.
I think it pretty much has been accepted that the brain death is accepted now, where it was not before Reb Moshe. It was accepted as the end of life. There was a problem about the definition of the classical definition of death,
end of life.
Nothing to do. The end of life had nothing to do with the brain. Had to do with the ceasing of the heart and the circulation of blood.
Right.
Modern information came up about brain death being definitive, and I think Reb Moshe made a pronouncement on which was different from most of the Piskei Halacha up until that time. And then even after he was gone, there was a dispute about what he meant and
what he meant. Yeah.
And it was either Reb Reuven or Reb David. I don't remember which one.
One of them, and then Reb Moshe Tendler. Yeah.
But they differed on Reb Moshe really.
What Reb Moshe meant when he said that brain death is the end of life. So again, you're right. It's a wonderful example of how that even pervades today, not only in the time of the Gemara. So that when we say teku, we don't say it, but when we say teku, it's because we're really in a bind. And now this is enough of a bind, but still, it's not worthy of a teku. So the Gemara gives us an answer. Sometimes when there's really no answer, then we say teku. We throw up our hands and say, you know what, guys, let's just leave it because we don't know how to answer the shaila. But it's fascinating to see in the time of the Gemara because we always want to put our minds back to the 2nd century, the 3rd century. What was the thinking of these gedolim? How did they understand things? And sometimes it's a little bit complicated beyond us. Yeah.